Bernie, AOC, Mandani are not Democrats. They'll be the first to tell you that. They're Democratic Socialists, and that's a very different thing, and I don't think people know that yet. The DSA are radicals about this concept, and radical economic policy is always ineluctably married to radical social policy. Their platform, for example, calls for completely open borders. They're for what Biden was doing, but more. You think you're going to win an election on that? James Carville knew how to win, and he blamed the Democratic losses this November 2nd on stupid wokeness, to which AOC fired back that wokeness is a term almost exclusively used by older people these days. So that should tell you all you need to know. What? This is a term folks like you brought out very recently and had been proudly displaying at every march since. Just last year, The Guardian declared woke the word of our era. I guess they didn't get the memo from the Mean Girls Club. We don't use that emoji anymore. Woke, please. We say fetch now.
Here's something that might completely change the way you look at modern American politics. Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and many of their political allies aren't traditional Democrats at all. In fact, they openly describe themselves as Democratic Socialists, and that distinction is far more significant than most people realize. Bill Maher recently tore into this issue on his show, delivering one of the most brutally honest critiques of progressive political strategy in recent memory. He didn't just criticize individuals. He exposed what he believes is a deeper structural problem behind why these high-profile politicians repeatedly stumble when it matters most. According to Maher, the issue goes beyond personalities. It's about the entire strategy. He uses a striking analogy. Democratic socialism, he says, is like a dating profile. On paper, everything looks perfect. The photos are impressive, the bio sounds inspiring, and the promises feel convincing. But when reality arrives, the expectations collapse. Maher points to Vermont, the home state of Bernie Sanders, as a powerful example. When leaders attempted to implement Sanders' flagship policy, single-payer health care, the plan ultimately fell apart. And this wasn't happening in a hostile environment. Vermont is one of the most progressive states in the country, with a population of just over 600,000 people. If a policy cannot successfully function in a small, politically friendly state like Vermont, Maher asks a critical question. How could it possibly work for a nation of over 300 million people? So far, that question remains largely unanswered.
Democratic socialism is like a dating profile. Things look great until you meet up in the real world. For example, Bernie Sanders, his big thing was always bringing single-payer health care to our country of 340 million. But when liberal, tie-dyed Vermont tried to do it for a population of 626,000, it collapsed like that poor in the Oval Office last week.
Here's where the debate becomes even more fascinating. Bill Maher points out something many Americans overlook. The United States already operates with numerous forms of government-driven social programs. Programs like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, unemployment benefits, food assistance, veterans benefits, Pell Grants, farm subsidies, disability payments, and even massive corporate bailouts all represent elements of government-directed economic support. In other words, forms of socialism already exist within the American system. However, when politicians like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez push for significantly expanding government control, many voters grow uneasy. It's not necessarily that Americans oppose helping people. The deeper concern is about limits. How far does government expansion go before it begins to undermine economic balance? That uncertainty makes voters cautious.
I don't think people realize we already have a lot of socialism. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, unemployment insurance, food stamps, veterans benefits, Pell Grants, COVID-era payments, farm subsidies, disability payments, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, corporate bailouts, and the jobs program that is building weapons the Pentagon doesn't even want. All that is socialism.
This leads directly to the biggest obstacle of all, the label itself. The term Democratic Socialist may sound harmless or even idealistic to some audiences, but for a large portion of American voters, the word socialist immediately triggers alarm. Whether fair or unfair, the term carries heavy historical baggage. It evokes fears of excessive government control, economic instability, and failed political experiments. And in politics, perception often matters more than intention. You could present well-designed policies with good intentions, but if your political branding pushes voters away before they even listen, the battle is already lost. Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez may govern more moderately than critics claim, but the label itself creates resistance among moderates and swing voters, groups that ultimately decide national elections.
The DSA are radicals about this concept, and radical economic policy is always ineluctably married to radical social policy. Their platform, for example, calls for completely open borders. They're for what Biden was doing, but more. You think you're going to win an election on that? This just seems like more extremism at a time when Americans are begging both parties, please, could just one of you act normal?
Another issue Bill Maher highlights is the growing frustration among ordinary voters. Across the political spectrum, many Americans feel exhausted by constant ideological extremes. What they increasingly want is something much simpler, leaders who appear rational, practical, and grounded. Maher makes his own beliefs clear. He considers himself a capitalist. He argues that capitalism supports a fundamental American principle, the ability for individuals to shape their own destiny, the freedom to make choices, pursue opportunities, and live with the outcomes of those decisions. That idea forms a foundation of what many call the American dream. Maher believes socialism, even democratic socialism, risks weakening this principle by concentrating authority in centralized institutions rather than empowering individuals. Whether one agrees or disagrees with that argument, it undeniably resonates with millions of voters. For many Americans, the issue isn't greed. It's the belief that people should have the power to write their own story.
It's either defund the police or military in the streets. Either MAGA's crypto crony capitalism or city-run grocery stores. No, I don't want that. I want a Democrat who reassures me if you like your Whole Foods, you can keep your Whole Foods.
Bill Maher also delivers a sharp critique of the leadership style of Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Instead of shaping a broad political message capable of appealing to mainstream voters, Maher argues they often amplify the loudest activist voices within their movement. They headline massive rallies filled with passionate chants and activist energy, but according to Maher, that approach does little to win over moderates or independent voters. Even more concerning, he says, is how they respond when radical factions accuse them of not being progressive enough, particularly on sensitive geopolitical issues. Rather than firmly establishing policy positions, they often appear to navigate competing activist demands. And Maher delivers a blunt conclusion. That isn't leadership. That's following. And followers...
Governor-elect Spanberger once said about Biden's presidency that, quote, nobody elected him to be FDR. They elected him to be normal. Normal! You know, at this year's DSA convention, or as it's commonly known, Comic-Con, get this, you had to submit a photo of a negative COVID test to get in. In 2025. Yeah, no one wants to do that shit again. We've had enough of Trump's macho and also enough of politics.
One moment Maher highlights perfectly illustrates what he believes is the growing disconnect between activist culture and ordinary voters. At a Democratic Socialist convention, delegates were reportedly instructed to use silent jazz hands instead of clapping because applause might overwhelm certain attendees. Participants were also advised to avoid wearing strong scents. Maher's reaction was disbelief, followed by ridicule. His larger point isn't simply about one unusual event. It's about what it symbolizes. A political culture increasingly focused on niche sensitivities that many everyday voters struggle to understand. Maher argues that influential figures like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez should challenge these excesses. Instead, they often appear to accommodate them or avoid confronting them publicly. And that silence, he argues, alienates moderate voters who view this kind of messaging as confusing, excessive, or simply bizarre. You cannot build a broad national coalition while constantly prioritizing the most specialized concerns of a small activist base.
These Democratic Socialists at another of their conventions, they were told to make jazz hands instead of clapping, lest some delegates suffer sensory overload. And also, and I'm not joking, they were told not to be wearing, any aggressive scents.
Please don't go into that space with anything that's like an aggressive scent, for instance, right? Because that's going to be difficult for people.
Oh, for sake. This.
In a surprising twist, Bill Maher even praises Chuck Schumer, someone who's criticized repeatedly in the past. Why the sudden approval? Because Maher believes Schumer occasionally demonstrates the type of leadership he thinks Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez lack, the willingness to push back against ideological pressure. Maher highlights Schumer's warnings about rising anti-Semitism within segments of the political left. When protest rhetoric crossed a line from legitimate criticism into dangerous prejudice, Schumer publicly condemned it, even when doing so angered elements within his own party. According to Maher, that takes courage. And it represents the kind of leadership that shapes movements rather than simply reacting to them.
Why is the party that supports so many issues that benefit the middle class still considered out of touch by 62% of Americans? In plain English, nobody likes a snob. Hillary Clinton didn't have anyone on rural research or outreach when she ran in 2016 until the race tightened just before the election. Then they hired one. And where was his office? Brooklyn. True story. Politics is local, not locally sourced. It's not artisan. It's art and stand.
Maher ultimately expands his critique to the Democratic Party as a whole. He asks a striking question. Why does a party that supports many policies benefiting the middle class still appear disconnected from ordinary Americans? His answer is blunt. Many voters perceive the party as arrogant or culturally detached. He recalls an example from Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign. Her team reportedly did not assign anyone to study rural voters until the race became dangerously close. And when they finally created the role, the office was located in Brooklyn, New York, far removed from the rural communities they were supposed to understand. For Maher, that symbolizes a fundamental misunderstanding of American politics. Politics is local, and successful campaigns require genuine engagement with the people they claim to represent.
James Carville knew how to win, and he blamed the Democratic losses this November 2nd on stupid wokeness, to which AOC fired back that wokeness is a term almost exclusively used by older people these days. So that should tell you all you need to know. What? This is a term folks like you brought out very recently and had been proudly displaying at every march since. Just last year, The Guardian declared woke the word of our era. I guess they didn't get the memo from the Mean Girls Club. We don't use that emoji anymore. Woke, please. We say fetch now.
The irony, Maher argues, is that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez now tries to distance herself from the woke label, even though many of her public positions align closely with the movement's ideology. From aggressively progressive policy proposals to vocal support for activist campaigns, her political identity remains deeply tied to that culture. Maher believes this creates a major disconnect between political messaging and public perception. You can reject a label verbally, but if your actions consistently reinforce it, voters will draw their own conclusions. In the end, Bill Maher presents a clear argument about why the Democratic Socialist strategy continues to struggle. The label frightens voters. The policies often collapse when tested in reality. Leadership appears reactive rather than decisive, and the messaging frequently alienates anyone outside the core activist base. Whether you admire Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or strongly oppose them, one fact remains unavoidable. Bold ideas mean little if they cannot win elections and become real policy. And according to Maher, the evidence suggests the current strategy simply isn't working.